Thank you. If the emotional and spiritual lives of so many were not presently entwined with his story, Joseph Smith would be nothing more than an interesting historical puzzle. But he is more than that. The church is without question Joseph Smith's most enduring legacy, for without it he would have long since faded into obscurity to join Jemima Wilkinson, Ann Lee, Joseph Dykes, Isaac Bullard, William Miller, and other lesser oracles and failed prophets. Joseph Smith lives through you, the church. You are therefore part of his story, not simply because you are preservers of his memory, but because you are also co-creators and consumers. While historian Jan Ships has said, the mystery of Mormonism cannot be solved till we solve the mystery of Joseph Smith, I maintain that the mystery of Joseph Smith cannot be solved until we understand better the larger mystery of the attraction of the charismatic leader and the equally mysterious devotion of the true believer. When one understands more fully the symbiosis of the leader and follower, then perhaps Joseph Smith will seem less a puzzle and more like a person trying to fulfill his own needs through his followers. So what I am suggesting is that part of the mystery, part of Joseph Smith's elusiveness, is that we have not paid enough attention to the other half of the equation. Shaman, prophets, heroes, and charismatic leaders are in important ways social constructs because they mirror back to their followers what is demanded of them. Cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker describes this interdependence between leaders and followers. The qualities of the leader and the problems of the people fit together in a natural symbiosis. People project their problems onto him, which gives him his role and stature. Leaders need followers as much as they are needed by them. The leader projects onto the followers his own inability to stand alone, his own fear of isolation. We must say that if there were no natural leaders possessing the magic of charisma, men would have to invent them, just as leaders must create followers if there are none available. Summarizing Wilfred R. Byon's work in group psychology, Becker further observes that the leader is as much a creature of the group as they of him, and that he loses his individual distinctiveness by being the leader, as they do by being followers. He has no more freedom to be himself than any other member of the group, precisely because he has to be a reflex of their assumptions in order to qualify for leadership in the first place. For this reason, I suspect the real Joseph Smith will always remain somewhat elusive. So I turn to an examination of his interpreters, those who have struggled to make sense of him, who have ventured to solve what Ships called the prophet puzzle. There are in fact many possible constructions of Joseph Smith, and depending on how one assesses the evidence, a completely different Joseph Smith will emerge. But this is exactly as Joseph Smith wanted it, both as a treasure seer and as a prophet. His claims demanded belief or skepticism. Thus, as stated in the first paragraph of my biography, Joseph Smith has been variously described as pretender after worldly power, religious fanatic, or God's mouthpiece on earth. Such strong reaction doubtless stems from Smith's own claims, specifically his declaration that all churches are false, and that those who reject the gospel he restored will be damned. For Smith, there was no middle ground, and thus seemingly no middle ground for assessing him or his claims. But I ask, is a middle ground possible or even desirable? Is not the search for a middle ground itself antithetical to the essence of Joseph Smith's personality and message? In his provocative essay, A Joseph Smith for the 21st Century, biographer Richard Bushman worries that the growing tolerance of non-Mormon scholars would bring a blurring of the real issues, and asks, wouldn't believing biographers prefer to have the question of authenticity laid squarely before our readers, even at the cost of having the revelations disputed? Do we want Joseph Smith's challenge to the world to be lost in a haze of patronizing kindness? Obviously, this worry doesn't apply to my writings, but rather to the Academy of Religion, which brackets truth claims for other reasons than patronizing kindness. Scholarship simply lacks the tools necessary to make the kinds of determinations Bushman seems to call for. Strictly speaking, scholars cannot answer questions like, was Joseph Smith a true prophet? And is the Book of Mormon inspired? However, I would argue that there are more interpretive choices than some in the Academy would have us believe. For while Joseph Smith's truth claims are beyond the scope of scholarship, the Book of Mormon's historical status is another matter. I would argue that historians are free to conclude the Book of Mormon is not historical, and to revision Joseph Smith's biography accordingly. In other words, a non-historical Book of Mormon presents scholars with a different interpretive paradigm from which to view Joseph Smith. To some apologists, Joseph Smith cannot be a true prophet if the Book of Mormon is not real history. For God and prophets do not engage in deception. BYU professor William J. Hamlin, for example, emphatically states, the issue is, if the Book of Mormon is fiction, then Joseph Smith could not be a true prophet, a point tacitly accepted by most of those who reject historicity, since all of their accounts include serious equivocation or redefinition of the key concepts of revelation, inspiration, and prophet. A non-historical Book of Mormon might be a serious challenge to some believers, but the consequences of that proposition are not as clear as Hamlin represents. It's not as if these terms haven't already been redefined by apologists themselves to accommodate changes Joseph Smith made in subsequent editions of the Book of Mormon and early Revelations, as well as corrections he made to the Bible. Without such equivocation, it would be difficult to explain various historical and literary anachronisms that appear in the Book of Mormon. To accommodate various parallels in the Book of Mormon to the 19th century, many apologists have adopted Blake Ostler's theory that Joseph Smith made inspired expansions to the ancient text, so in principle they have already equivocated on fundamental definitions of key terms. Hamlin's dichotomy is therefore false because there is a third and viable alternative even for believers. While the issue of true-false prophet is beyond scholarship, historians can ask such questions as, what was Joseph Smith's definition of prophet? Did he believe God sometimes inspires deception? What was his definition of inspiration? And finally, do Joseph Smith's definitions of these terms exclude a non-historical Book of Mormon? I believe the answer to this question is no. When Moroni exhorts readers to ask God if these things are not true, and promises that he will manifest the truth of it unto you, the text points to a specific kind of truth. Previously, Moroni quoted God as saying, because of my spirit, he shall know that these things are true, for it persuadeth men to do good. And whatsoever thing persuadeth men to do good is of me. For good cometh of none, save it be of me. I am the same that leadeth men to all good. Similarly, Mormon reasons, I show unto you the way to judge, for everything which inviteth to do good, and to persuade to believe in Christ, is sent forth by the power and gift of Christ. Wherefore ye may know with a perfect knowledge it is of God. In other words, since all good comes from God, and the Book of Mormon tries to persuade humankind to be righteous and believe in Christ, it is consistent with this line of reasoning that the Book of Mormon is true and inspired independent of whether, in the final analysis, it is considered historical. This concept of inspiration ties in well with Joseph Smith's definition of prophet. In a letter published in the Elders' Journal in July 1838, Joseph Smith responded to the question, do you believe Joseph Smith Jr. to be a prophet? His answer was, yes, and every other man who has the testimony of Jesus, and quoted Revelation 19:10. For the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. To return to Hamlin's definition, I hypothesize that Joseph Smith believed himself to be an inspired prophet, only not in the way that he led his followers to believe. Thus, I see Joseph Smith as sincere in his claims, but willing to use deception to win souls for God. In my view, he believed his Book of Mormon project to be inspired by God, but he manufactured plates and manipulated witnesses to increase faith. I also want to challenge the notion that bracketing truth claims requires uncritical acceptance of Joseph Smith's version of events. For the historian, there is simply no justification for privileging Smith's autobiographies in ways not done for other prominent people. Autobiographies, especially those produced institutionally, are, in the words of British historiographer John Tosh, often inaccurate and selective to the point of distortion, notorious for their errors of recall and their special pleading. Louis Gottschalk's Historical Primer warns that official histories tend to suppress embarrassing, incriminating, and confidential information and to present apologia. A critical assessment of Joseph Smith's autobiographies will therefore resist the impulse to harmonize, but highlight changes in detail and emphasis, attempting to verify details against external sources. Seek to reconstruct chronology and uncover anachronism. Take note of events glossed over or suppressed, and listen carefully for apologia and rhetorical manipulation. The purpose of such an exercise would not necessarily be to raise questions about the veracity of Smith's truth claims, although a non-historical Book of Mormon would entail such issues, but rather as a means of exploring the manner in which he tailored his image to serve the needs of his followers. Apologetic concerns are apparent right from the first line of Smith's 1838 autobiography. Owing to the many reports which have been put in circulation by evil-disposed and designing persons, he began, I have been induced to write this history so as to disabuse the public mind and put all inquirers after truth into possession of the facts. Contrary to this promise, Smith was less than forthcoming when he misrepresented his involvement in money digging as a one-time event in 1825 as one of Josiah Stoll's hired hands. In fact, however, he was a leader in many such operations over a period of at least 3 years, locating the places where to dig with his seer stone. Non-Mormon historian Alan Taylor, who charitably referred to Smith's prevarication as de-emphasis, suggested that Smith recognized that a reputation for treasure-seeking was a handicap in communicating his message to an audience increasingly committed to rationality and a more abstract understanding of religion. Jan Ships was also charitable when she said, "It seems reasonable to conclude that the motive for playing down this part of the prophet's background was the knowledge that it could be used as the basis for charges that might endanger his reputation." Actually, Joseph Smith was doing more than preserving his reputation. He was overhauling his history and reinventing himself to become a more suitable leader for his followers and potential followers. If Smith was to consolidate and expand his authority and influence, his story would have to lose its cultural particularity and become more universal. Thus, it is also quite apparent, as D. Michael Quinn and others have demonstrated, that Joseph Smith de-emphasized the folk magic and treasure-seeking context of his 1823 and 1827 encounters with Moroni and inserted anachronistic elements such as the terms angel and Urim and Thummim and the reference to Elijah returning to reveal the priesthood, all of which gave it a more mainstream Christian flavoring. In similar fashion, it is apparent that Smith recast his first vision from a personal revelation of forgiveness to one that foreshadowed his calling as a prophet. While I accept Smith experienced a dramatic conversion to Jesus about 1820, I find the insertion of various elements into the story, such as the revival, the conversions of Lucy and the other family members to Presbyterianism, the presence of the Father, the injunction to join none of the churches, and his being persecuted for telling his vision, to be anachronistic. Thus, I agree with Marvin Hill's assessment that Smith conflated elements from 1820 and 1824 to create a useful fiction. One important task of historians, writes Tosh, is to challenge socially motivated misrepresentations of the past. I would suggest that this not only applies to present interpreters, but to Joseph Smith as well. Speaking of autobiographies, Tosh also states, "But in their very subjectivity often lies their greatest value, since the pattern that the writer makes of his or her own life is a cultural as much as a personal construct, and it also illuminates the frame of mind in which not only the book was written, but the life itself was led." And I ask, how was that life led? As Becker would answer, as a reflex of his followers' assumptions. German sociologist Max Weber explained the relationship between the followers and charismatic leaders this way. The holder of charisma seizes the task and demands obedience and a following by virtue of his mission. His success determines whether he finds them. His charismatic claim breaks down if his mission is not recognized by those to whom he feels he has been sent. If they recognize him, he is their master, so long as he knows how to maintain recognition through proving himself. But he does not derive his right from their will in the manner of an election. Rather, the reverse holds. It is the duty of those to whom he addresses his mission to recognize him as their charismatically qualified leader. And so you see, the making of the prophet was and is as much your doing as it was Joseph Smith's. Thanks for listening.